Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. Hey everyone, welcome to our series on the most important battles in the Civil War, the 10 most important battles specifically. We're on number 9. Last episode, we began, and we were looking at Atlanta and the March to the Sea, Sherman's March to the Sea. It's all grouped together, so we thought we would make a two-parter out of this. In the last episode, we ended with the fall of Atlanta, the resounding Union victory, not so much resounding in numbers, although they definitely bested the Confederates, but in terms of morale, it was critical for the Union. This has direct impact on Northern morale. More importantly, this has direct impact on the election of 1864, which for years, both sides were looking to as a bellwether of whether or not Union victory would be possible because their morale might be sapped so much. So let's start there, and then after we look at the election of 1864, we'll look at our friend General Hood and his march into Tennessee after he is forced to leave Atlanta. He's derided as one of the most ruthlessly and recklessly aggressive generals in the Confederacy in the Civil War, and we'll see how he fares. Finally, we'll look at Sherman's March to the Sea. So, James, let's start things off with the election of 1864.
Yes, it's important that even though this is not a battle, it's not a military event, we've talked about before how closely linked that the political and the military parts of the Civil War are connected. So I want to back up a little in time. We talked about the fall of Atlanta, which happened in early September of 1864, but let's back up to the summer. Let's pretend that we don't know Atlanta is going to fall into Union hands. If you go back to the summer of 1864, the Union war effort seemed to be going terribly. Sherman was stalled out in front of Atlanta. We saw earlier how Hood had kind of checked his advance with some of these attacks that he did, even though they turned out to be not well advised, let's say. They were very costly for the Confederacy. And Grant had been fighting Lee for a couple months, and he had lost 60,000 men in 1 month. And he was stuck in front of Petersburg, Virginia. And other Union efforts had failed as well. We talked about Banks was trying to invade Texas and didn't work, as usually was the case. And Benjamin Butler and Franz Sigel had jobs to do. And I hate to spoil this, but they're also going to blow it. So these things are not going well. This great 5-part plan that we talked about in the last episode that Grant had hoped to unleash on the Confederacy, it looked like all 5 parts of it were complete failures. There was a great amount of opposition to Lincoln in the North, even among Republicans. You know, we forget that sometimes. We tend to think that the Republican Party was totally on board with Lincoln and his program, but that's not the case. Lincoln was assaulted on all sides. You know, the Democrats thought he was too tough on the South. There were a lot of Republicans to his right that thought he was too wimpy and too soft on the South, too indulgent of these commanders that were failing right and left. Now, Lincoln could have suspended the elections. Almost every other country in the world in this kind of a situation had done that, but he chose not to. This is what he said. This is a nice quotation. He said, "We cannot have free government without elections. And if the rebellion could force us to forego or postpone a national election, it might fairly claim to have already conquered and ruined us." So that's really statesmanlike of Lincoln. Lincoln gets a lot of criticism for some of the things he did. He cracked down on civil rights in some areas. He threw people in jail without trial. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, but he doesn't suspend the elections. Here, again, he says, in essence, if I can paraphrase this quote, if we don't have this election, then we've already lost. So I think that's pretty impressive. This is the first time the U.S. had ever had an election in the middle of a war, and it was the first time in history any nation had had one in the midst of a civil war. As far as I know. Now, I don't know every single election and every war and I don't know all of history. So if somebody listening can think of an example and to correct me on that, then please do. Send an angry email to Scott.
I'm used to it by now, so I know when to hit delete when I
That's
see the
right.
subject
But
line.
as far as I know, no country had ever had an election in the midst of a civil war. All right, so let's talk about the radical Republicans. The Republicans I mentioned to the right of Lincoln who thought he was too soft on the South, too wimpy. They wanted to dump him for John C. Fremont. We've talked about Fremont several times. Well, I won't take any time to talk about him, but let's just say he was more of an abolitionist, more of a radical than Lincoln. Or even Salmon P. Chase. Salmon P. Chase was Lincoln's very own Secretary of the Treasury. So Salmon P. Chase is actually kind of hoping maybe he'll get nominated and they'll dump Lincoln because he thought he knew what to do better than Lincoln did. But neither one of these efforts come to anything. They both eventually fail, and most Republicans eventually do rally behind Lincoln. The Republicans do something kind of shrewd in this election. They change their name. You know, we tend to think of the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, the two-party system, which we've had for a long, long, long time, over 150 years. We think of it as something timeless and eternal, but it actually wasn't. We have to remember that at this time in 1864, the Republican Party was still brand new. It was 10 years old, which is new for a political party. So they changed their name to the National Union Party. See, that's a stroke of propagandic genius because they're saying we're the party of the Union. We're the party that's loyal. Just by that very name, they're accusing Democrats of being disloyal and against the Union. The sitting vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, who hadn't really had much of a role in the government, he was dumped. They got rid of him. The Republican Party did. I must say that at this point, the presidential candidates did not choose their vice presidents like we see today. The parties had conventions and they chose them. So really, Lincoln didn't get much of a say in this. I don't think he had a problem with this. There's a strategic reason they do this. Hannibal Hamlin didn't do anything wrong necessarily, but they picked Andrew Johnson from Tennessee. And as we're going to see, he's going to have a big future. Just to refresh our listeners on Andrew Johnson's background, Johnson was a Southerner. He was kind of like Lincoln in that he was raised in poverty, and he educated himself. He read a lot. He studied. He became a lawyer, became a successful lawyer, and then worked his way up through the political ranks. He had been governor of Tennessee. He had been a senator from Tennessee at the time of the Civil War's outbreak, and he was the only Southern senator who did not resign from the Senate and throw their weight behind the Confederate effort. He hated secession. He was radical Unionist. Now, he was not an abolitionist by any stretch of the imagination. No. But he
owned slaves, didn't he?
He did own slaves. That's correct. And as we're going to see after the Civil War, we're not really going to cover Reconstruction, but a lot of our listeners may know that he's not going to be in favor of helping out the freed slaves later. But at this time, Lincoln wants to reward him. He wants to tell the nation, look, I've got a Southerner on my ticket, or not so much Lincoln, but the party. I think Lincoln certainly was in favor of this too, but it was really the party wanted to have a united image. They're trying to get Tennessee back into the Union. So this is sending a message to the rest of the country. You know, we're not a bunch of radical abolitionist, extreme radical Republicans. We've got a Southerner. He was a Democrat, by the way. So they're trying to reach across party lines and build unity. Lincoln had a famous saying. He said to the voters, don't change horses in midstream. Again, another very Lincoln-esque kind of quote, which gets used later in American political history. But the idea is, why would you want to get a different president right in the middle of a war? That would be a terrible thing to do. Well, the Democrats, of course, completely disagreed with that. They wanted to change horses in midstream, and the horse they wanted to run the country was our old friend, our beloved, not former General George McClellan. George McClellan had always been a Democrat. He has always been critical of the way Lincoln ran the war. McClellan promised to make peace with the South, and Democrats based their hopes for victory on the desire for peace among Northerners. McClellan was a war Democrat. We talked about the two different kind of Democrats. He wanted to win the war, but he didn't want to conquer the South. He didn't want to free the slaves. He didn't want to remake the South in the image of the North. Nothing like that. He just wanted to bring the war to he wanted peace with honor, basically. But the platform was a peace platform. It had been written by the peace Democrats who just wanted to shut it down right now. Let's just end it and go back to the way things were before the war. And as I mentioned, let's just,
the irony.
I know.
Yeah.
I mean, people don't understand sometimes that you can't go back to the past. Sometimes you hear that today. Oh, if we could just be like things were in the 80s or the 50s or something. No. You can't, and especially when the war had changed everything so radically.
Well, I have to ask 2 questions. First of all, does the press have a field day making fun of McClellan, the former general, for having to be this peace activist? Second, are his political campaigns as slow as his military campaigns?
Well, I'll answer the second one first. The candidates back in this day did not go out and campaign themselves. It was deemed as beneath their dignity. It was you were supposed to not want to be president. Candidates were supposed to say, well, if the country wants me, then yes, I'm going to do it, but I'm not out there begging people to make me president, which of course was an act. It was a farce, but so McClellan himself didn't go out and do stump speeches and tour the country like candidates do today and have for quite some time. People did it for him. So, I guess you could say it was slow in that he didn't really campaign at all.
Just like his military campaigns.
Exactly. Do nothing. But at least with the political campaign, he was doing what he was supposed to do. And what was the other question? I've already forgotten.
Oh, nothing. Just the irony, I guess, of the military general.
Well, the Republican press certainly made a lot of fun of him, but the Democratic press just said, hey, this is our hope. This man will make peace. This man, he knows what it's like to lead an army. Lincoln didn't know anything about that. McClellan, if McClellan had, it's kind of weird to argue that when you look at his record, he was a war Democrat running with a peace Democrat platform, which made it very awkward for him. He didn't really like all the planks of the platform, but they just swept that under the rug for the sake of hopefully winning. All right, we had seen that there'd been a lot of Union, if not disasters, then just kind of stalling out and not winning, if not losing. Lincoln felt sure in the summer of 1864 that he would lose. This is what he wrote. He said, "This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the president-elect as to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such ground that he cannot possibly save it afterward." So that's very magnanimous of Lincoln. And Lincoln says, number one, I don't think I'm going to win, and if I do not win, I'm going to help the new president to save the Union. I'm going to do everything I can. So that's very mature of Lincoln. I don't think McClellan would have done that. One interesting thing about this election in 1864 is that many U.S. soldiers were allowed to take trains to the polls and vote. You didn't really have absentee balloting like we do today. So, today, if you're a soldier and you're stationed, let's say in Iraq, Afghanistan, Germany, South Korea, wherever, you can just absentee vote. But that didn't happen for the most part back then. So you had to actually go home and vote in your home district. And it was very shrewd of Lincoln to allow these soldiers because, again, there wasn't always a lot of fighting going on. And when there's no fighting going on, they're just sitting around. So send them home, let them vote, and bring them back real quick. They were able to do that because they had so many trains, and so much railroad track. And it was determined later they were able to, in a lot of places, count the soldiers' votes separate. And 80% of soldiers who voted for Lincoln. So that's pretty amazing when you consider if these are guys that if they vote against Lincoln, they probably are going to get to go home pretty soon. If they vote for Lincoln, the war is probably going to continue for a while longer, but they vote for Lincoln anyway. I think that really speaks a lot for Lincoln and his leadership, that he inspired people to vote for him, even though doing so might be against their own, what would you say, their own personal interest, their own physical body in some cases. All right. Just prior to the election, Union forces won several victories. We talked about, of course, the fall of Atlanta, and we'll talk about some others